Thank you very much. I suppose I ought to apologize because I'm going to speak in English. In part, I'm going to speak in English because it's a kind of protest against the fact that virtually everything I wanted to say was said by my French colleagues this morning or this afternoon, and I suppose I must preserve the traditional differences that exist between us. So I hope you'll forgive me if I do. The second reason why I'm speaking in English is because I come from the Anglo-Saxon world. The Anglo-Saxon world tends to be very literalist in the way in which it approaches issues put to it. And I was asked originally to discuss the new economic geography that Morocco would face in 2030. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. That's to say, I'm really going to look at the economic environment in which I think Morocco is going to exist. And I'm going to be looking not at political or social constraints, but primarily at economic ones. And there too, not so much at those that governments can affect, but at the structural constraints that I think, in effect, a country like Morocco is going to face at that time. Let me begin by making a comment about globalization. There is a tendency to think that the phenomenon of globalization is somehow new. Seems to me that that's wrong. It's an incredibly old phenomenon. It's been going on for centuries. What's new about it, I think, are three things. Number one, the rate at which it's accelerating, and that is quite phenomenal. And it's that perhaps that grabs our attention and our imagination. Secondly, the way in which, certainly since the end of the Second World War, it has been a project, a primarily Western project, directed towards the rest of the world. And thirdly, it's been asymmetric, and as such, has been a question of a kind of domination. Now, it's possible that that's open to contestation at the moment, and that will form part of my remarks. But having said that, I have to add that I'm not sure that globalization is really the issue that I wish to address. It seems to me that within globalization, and this was a point that was mentioned this morning, there is a parallel phenomenon that actually in some respects is more important. And that's the way in which, rather than a globalizing geo-economic world, we look at a world which is increasingly regionalized. And therefore, to a large extent, I'm going to be talking about a phenomenon known in English as glocalization. In other words, the implications of globalization, but at a regional level, because it seems to me that is actually the world into which Morocco is going to be projected. I think also, before I can really make any comments about that world, I need to say something about what I think Morocco will be like in 25 years' time. In very general terms, because of course all predictions run the risk of being wrong, and the longer term they are, the more likely they are to be wrong, it does seem to me that in some 25 years, Morocco is going to have a population of between 40 and 50 million people. The interesting thing about that population, though, is that unlike the population today, where there is a growing number of people below the age of 30, declines in birth rates since the 1990s imply that there will be a bulge moving up through the age pyramid, and thus some of the pressures that in growing population may imply may not be there. One thing that is certain is that it's going to be urbanized. This morning we heard that up to 90% of Moroccans will live in cities. That may be an overstatement, but certainly a majority will. Agriculture will have become a minor employer, and that has certain implications in terms of the economic choices available. I hope if that's the case that Morocco will have abandoned the World Bank's infatuation with non-traditional exports, which seem to me to be something which in the future will not be sustainable, because along with the growth in population and its urbanization, Morocco is going to find itself in an increasingly marginalized environment. Desertification is going to accelerate. Climate change will make that inevitable, and measures will have to be taken to deal with the fact that access to natural sources of water are going to decline markedly. Now, of course, there are all sorts of ways of doing that. They all involve energy. And that's perhaps the fourth point that I would like to mention. Morocco's energetic dependence is going to grow, necessarily, even if the oil shale of the south is exploited. It will depend, as in the past, I suspect, on imported energy, particularly gas. And although I recognize the attraction of gas from Latin America, the fact is that Morocco is already tied into a pipeline system dominated by Europe that extends eastwards and not westwards. I see no reason for that to change. In fact, if it does, it will only really change by the extension of that gas grid southwards towards Nigeria. In other words, Morocco is tied in already to a particular pattern of energy supply, and I don't think that will change. There is one way in which probably there'll be a new addition, and that is solar power is going to become far more important. And Morocco, like the other countries of North Africa, is well placed to be able to exploit that. I hope very much that that occurs. Now, I think I can sum up the problems arising from a world like that in the following terms. There are perhaps three key issues that remain. One is that the market size represented by the Moroccan economy will still be too small for endogamous growth. In other words, for Morocco to achieve effective economic development, it will have to rely on its relations with the wider world. That has an obvious implication, and perhaps the most important, that employment is going to continue to be a problem. There will be many people without work, seeking it. And beyond that, I doubt very much whether Morocco would have escaped from the other problem that faces the whole of North Africa, that of comparative advantage. In other words, rates of investment may not have significantly changed. Given all that, and given too the fact that trickle down to empower the poor is unlikely to have been very significant, migration, both domestic and as a transit country, will continue to be an important consideration. So how do we solve that particular dilemma? Well, and here again I can't pretend to be original, it seems to me there are four alternatives. There is the regional alternative, regional integration, Maghreb unity. There is the question of the Mediterranean and Europe. There's a possibility, of course, that the new hegemons, China, India, Southeast Asia, or Latin America, might offer an alternative instead. And finally, there's the question of the United States. Is a transatlantic relationship a better option than those that I've mentioned? Well, let me go through this as quick as I can. I have to say that it seems to me that the question of Maghrebi integration, of the revival of the Ummah, is unlikely. It has the advantage, if it occurred, it would allow for endogamous growth. To that extent, the European Union was right in its plan behind the Barcelona process. It would allow for market integration. It would allow for complementarity to show its benefits in terms of the playoff between Morocco and Tunisia on the one hand, Algeria and Libya on the other. But against that are some hard geopolitical realities. From what I've heard today, I have to say it seems to me most unlikely that the Western Saharan conflict is going to be resolved in regional terms. I'm struck by the fact that there is in the air, and I speak here not just about Morocco, a kind of intransigence over the issue. We need to remember that issue has lasted 30 years already. It can easily last for 30 more. It won't be the first dispute, by the way, in the North African and Middle Eastern region to have done that. And beyond that, even if it were resolved, I think there's another very important consideration that people tend to skate over. And it is the question of the way in which Algeria sees its regional role. And not just its regional role, its hegemonic regional role. I'm by no means convinced that that is going to change very much, whatever may happen in Algeria in terms of governance in the years to come. Now, given that, it seems to me it's very difficult to imagine that those regional tensions can be resolved even if the economic challenges can be met. Where does that leave us? Well, there is, of course, Europe, the tired old offer of a relationship with Europe. At the moment, rather looked down upon because the Barcelona framework is too rigid, the European Commission is too bureaucratic. The problem is that it seems to me that there is going to be a change in Europe. Europe will continue. It is an initiative of a kind that is found nowhere else in the world. It offers thereby an opportunity for a future. More than that, Europe is going to need North Africa, if only for questions of trying to deal with its own age pyramid itself. And thus, it seems to me Morocco will be tied, for reasons of trade too, into a hub-and-spoke relationship. What about the opportunities offered by the new hegemons, China and India in particular? They're certainly going to have an interest in access to resources, but whether indeed they can offer a viable alternative to Europe seems to me doubtful. The tensions in China particularly are profoundly underestimated by most commentators today. Given that, it seems to me unlikely that China really offers a viable alternative to the European paradigm. The United States, too, will be in, by that time, relative decline, even though, in many respects, it will still be the generator of transnational linkages. And from that point of view, I would have thought the European Union, with the complexity and depth of the interlinkages it already has, offers an obvious alternative, nor do I believe that it will become the Finisterre of the future. Are there new possibilities? And I will finish in 1 minute, I promise you. There is a possibility of economic regionalization, mentioned today in terms of the 5+5 agreements. But there are alternatives too. There is the possibility of an integration of poles of development. For example, the complex of Tangier and Tetuan with southern Spain. It's happening already in the rest of Europe. There's no reason why it shouldn't happen in the south as well. There is the pattern, the old trading pattern of the pre-colonial period, involving major cities around the Mediterranean basin, interlinking with each other. A possibility that may also develop again, particularly in the context of the knowledge economy of the future. Is there a possibility of a globalized alternative? Can really international companies offer a means by which some kind of global integration can occur? I doubt it. It will depend on the growth of a knowledge economy, something notoriously difficult to do outside the level of an elite. And that perhaps underlines the problem that Morocco really faces. That integration at the level of elites is certainly possible. But what do you do about the mass of the population that can't integrate at that level? Do you recreate the kind of dual economy typical of the colonial period? I fear that may well be the consequence of an undiluted bath in the prospects of globalization. Thank you.